Hello and welcome to the Edinburgh Science Festival. Why do we have stories about mermaids? Did a Pict warrior once hunt with her greyhounds when the seafloor between Hebridean islands was formerly dry land? Today you'll join Dr Patrick Nunn, award-winning geographer and climate scientist, as he discusses his new book and tells some of the stories about drowned lands from across the earth, the places we know and those which we should be more sceptical about. You can get a copy of Patrick's new book through our festival book sale partner Blackwell's. This event is free for you to enjoy thanks to our festival sponsors and supporters. Edinburgh Science is an educational charity. Please consider making a donation through our website to support the work we do.
I would like to thank you all for coming today and hearing what I have to say, and I hope that wherever you are in the world, you're safe and well. If there's one clear message that comes from my book, it is that we shall endure. For almost 200,000 years, our species has travelled to this point, along a road that was sometimes smooth, sometimes rocky, and even through times when our prospects of survival seemed almost hopeless. But the very fact that we are here today shows that we are resilient. This is the theme of my new book, Worlds in Shadow, Submerged Lands in Science, Memory and Myth, published by Bloomsbury. My name is Patrick Nunn. I'm a UK-trained geologist and geographer who has acquired over the past 2 decades an abiding curiosity about what may be termed myths and legends, but which are often culturally filtered observations of memorable events, some demonstrably more than 10,000 years old. I currently research and teach at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia, but spent much of my career doing something similar in the Pacific Islands and in England. I have a website at www.patricknunn.org with more details. It's a great honour to be here with you today at the 2021 Edinburgh Science Festival, and I hope I have something to say that will interest you. I remember one day being in a small boat travelling back to the capital of Fiji, Suva, from the offshore island of Moturiki. We crossed a deep water passage named Deveta Tambu, and the boat slowed down. All the people aboard removed their headgear, they fell silent and they bent their heads to show respect to the spirits dwelling on the ocean floor, the people of a submerged land called Vuni Ivi Levu. I became captivated by the way in which modern protocols of this kind kept alive memories of ancient catastrophe. Land rises and falls, sometimes abruptly, commonly gradually. The ocean surface, what is generally termed sea level, also rises and falls. And since modern humans have been around, there has been much more rise than fall. We live today in a drowned world, one in which the ocean surface is currently 50 meters, that's about 165 feet or so, higher than its average over the past 200,000 years. So it's unsurprising to find that human history is replete with stories about submerged lands. The goal of my book is to explain the nature and history of these lands, something that is partly informed by science, partly by memory, and partly by what many term myth. You may think, why include the latter two? Why not just depend on science alone? Well, science has its limitations, not least of which is that when you go back in time before the period of written history, science gives us only the bare bones. History dehumanized, if you like. And without intending to knock science as a source of knowledge and understanding, I do think that we invariably underestimate the potential contribution of memory and myth. In oral societies where people don't read or write, memories can be passed on in intelligible form for thousands of years across hundreds of generations. Now, a lot of literate people become rather uncomfortable with that idea. And believe me, I've heard it expressed often. But there is no empirical basis for disbelieving it, just an innate bias that most of us don't really acknowledge we have. The arrogance of literacy, I termed it in my last book, The Edge of Memory, this one here. And of course, before humans became literate, they depended on stories with sometimes ancient roots to shape and populate their understanding of the world they inhabited. Sometimes these stories were mythologized to make them more memorable. Often they were rendered in song or poems. Often they were expressed in dance or performance, preserved for posterity in rock art. Now today, we often regard such things as cultural inventions, but I argue that they represent the residue of pragmatic knowledge once passed on in oral societies from one generation to the next. During the last great ice age, which ended about 15,000 years ago, massive thick ice sheets had formed on the land in many places. Scotland was covered by an ice sheet, the great weight of which pushed the underlying Earth's crust outwards, forming, like a tight belt around a substantial waist, crustal bulges around the edge of the ice sheet. There were bulges in Brittany, Cornwall, Wales, and the south of Ireland that caused the land there at the time to rise. Now at this time the ocean surface was around 120 metres, that's almost 400 feet lower than it is today. There were also vast tracts of land where people lived which are now underwater. These include the English Channel and Doggerland, of course, but also further afield, the Baltic Sea and what is now the Torres Strait between Australia and New Guinea. After the last great ice age ended, the water from the melted land-based ice poured into the ocean, raising its level, often at rates far faster than we are experiencing today. This period of sea level rise lasted almost 8,000 years, submerging coastal lands and displacing their occupants, human and non-human alike. In a handful of places, like much of northwest Europe and places like Chesapeake Bay along the eastern seaboard of the United States, the sea level has been rising continuously since the last ice age, and it's no coincidence that ancient stories about submerged lands, from Cantre'r Gwaelod in Wales and Kêr-Is in Cornwall and Kêr-Is in Brittany, are more plentiful in these places than just about anywhere else in the world. You might ask why this is. Why are Wales and Cornwall and Brittany anomalous? Well, just loosen that belt drawn tight around that substantial waist and see how those bulges disappear. Pretty much the same thing happened when the ice covering Scotland and Ireland melted. The land there rose, while the land where the crustal bulges had been sank, a process that is continuing today. If that is the science, then consider the memory. I don't know about you, but among the top 10 places on my bucket list to visit is the now uninhabited island of St Kilda in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. The first written account of then inhabited St Kilda comes from the year 1697, and it includes a story about a warrior who once lived there and whom, I quote, was much addicted to hunting, and that in her days all the space between this island and that of Harris, 90 kilometres, that's about 56 miles away, was one continued tract of dry land, across which she frequently loosed her greyhounds while hunting deer. What do we make of such a story, and the complementary story told on the island of Harris? Well, considering it to be a very unlikely topic for invention, I prefer to regard it as an echo of a folk tradition, an ancient memory, recalling when, indeed, St Kilda was connected to the rest of the Hebrides, as it was during the lower sea level that followed the last ice age, perhaps as recently as 8,000 years ago. And what of myth? As an example, we need to look no further than stories about supposedly visible, yet unreachable islands offshore, typically off a continent, maybe even tales of mermaids. In 1825, from the west coast of Ireland, it was reported that the people of the Aran Islands, with characteristic enthusiasm, fancy that at certain periods they see the island of High Brazil elevated far to the west in their watery horizon. Now, similar stories are found in many other parts of the world and could, I suggest, be a way of remembering now submerged places that once existed there, and were inhabited by the ancestors of a now inhabited place? What other way of recalling the loss of such places in oral societies? In my book, I also discuss Tamil traditions of a lost land named Kumari Kandam off southernmost India, its geography and associations well preserved in Tamil poetry and narrative. It may not even be too far a stretch to suppose that our stories of inhabited lands beneath the sea, which often involve beings that are much like ourselves and do much the same things, like mermaids, to have been, at least in pre-Disney times, our culturally filtered ways of recalling the loss of land and its inhabitants, your ancestors. And why would we do that, you may ask? I suggest that the trauma associated with multi-generational land loss may have become hardwired into the human psyche. Can we ever imagine how it must have felt to have been an eyewitness to the process of post-glacial sea level rise, to have seen land being inexorably lost year after year, decade after decade, lifetime after lifetime? It would have been easy, I suggest, to have become hugely pessimistic about this, to imagine that all the land on which you lived would one day be submerged, and that would spell the end of you and your kin and the future you had once dreamed might be yours. Would you not have done all in your power, everything your understanding of the world said was possible, by way of response to counter this? Would you not have built sea defences as we do today? Would you not have prayed as we do today? People did all these things in the past as well. And in my book, I relate stories more than 7,000 years old that explain how the first Australians took practical measures to try and stop the encroachment of the sea across the fringes of the land they occupied, and many more. Food for thought, I suggest, with a robust evidence base. This reading comes from the last chapter of my new book, Worlds in Shadow. Along the Atlantic coasts of northwest Europe, where unusually sea level has been rising continuously since the last ice age ended, the occupants of now submerged cities like Cantre'r Gwaelod and Kêr-Is sought to extend their lifespan by the construction of sea defences. Overwhelmed eventually, these physical remedies would have been accompanied by spiritual ones. What these were is well nigh impossible to reimagine, you might think, although a bold attempt by a group of French scientists makes compelling reading. They studied the stone lines at Karnak, for me one of the wonders of our world. Understated, often overrun with grazing sheep, thousands of standing stones, or menhirs, extend in parallel rows for many kilometers across the landscape, and even beneath the ocean's surface. When they first came to the notice of Western science, the stone lines were thought to be astronomical alignments. They're not. Perhaps markers for graves of fallen warriors. No, they're not. Maybe even land boundaries. Also, no. The novel idea of scientists like Agnes Balzer and Serge Casson is that these standing stones were arranged to create a barrier between the material world and the metaphysical one, a cognitive barrier intended to prevent interference by the gods with the human world, specifically to stop the rise of the ocean across the land. All this is thought to have occurred to represent deductive reasoning by people living in the Karnak area 6,500 years ago, a time when there may have been a short-lived acceleration in the rate of sea level rise here that prompted desperate measures. It seems the response failed. Sea level continued rising here, its most emphatic retort being the submergence of parts of these stone lines. Now, from where you sit, you might think it was blindingly obvious that building stone lines to support an invisible mesh to stop deities interfering with earthly affairs would fail. But we today have little inkling about what people's belief systems entailed 6,000 years ago in this part of Europe. But what we can say, given the phenomenal effort involved in creating these stone lines, is that there must have been widespread belief in their likely efficacy. Such efforts were not isolated, although we're only just starting to glimpse how our ancestors, thousands of years ago, rationalized and responded to the rise of sea level. One clue lies in where and how they buried their dead. Many ancient cemeteries were located on coastal fringes, sometimes on small offshore islands, even in places that went underwater at high tide. Now, why would anyone choose to bury dead bodies along the edges of the land? The answer could be pragmatic. It was unvalued land, fit for little else. But more recent thinking on the matter has inclined more towards the idea that our distant ancestors viewed the coast as a place of transition between earthly and spiritual worlds. If you believe that the ocean covers the place where you will spend your life after death, what better spot to lay a dead body than right next to the ocean, along with all the items the dead person needs in the afterlife? Yet, however compelling this explanation might sound, its simplicity troubles me. We may be missing the bigger picture. One hint at what this might involve is the novel explanation for the stone lines at Carnac as being or supporting a cognitive barrier designed to halt rising sea level more than 6,000 years ago. Another hint lies in the extant stories of Aboriginal Australians, recalling the anxiety they felt at the inexorable rise of post-glacial sea level and the possibility it might engulf the entire land, a thought which prompted decisive action. Now, these two examples suggest to me that coastal peoples the world over felt threatened far more than we realize by the 7,000 years or so of rising sea level they experienced in the aftermath of the last ice age. Might that threat have weighed so heavily on coastal dwellers that they developed stories about the ocean as aggressor, as a swallower of land, and deified or demonized it? And having given it divine status, might people have then sought ways to appease it, to try and stop it drowning the land? It has been proposed that certain objects commonly used by coastal peoples thousands of years ago were invested with symbolic meaning and power. An example are the fish hooks made from elk bone used 10,000 years ago by the Mesolithic inhabitants of the Skagerrak coast of Norway and Sweden. The elk was a much admired animal, not least because it could live on the land, yet was also able to swim great distances across the ocean, dive and feed on water plants. It was considered a liminal creature, able to cross the boundary between land and sea more effortlessly than humans, which may have suggested to them that it had a privileged relationship with the ocean, even able to intercede on behalf of humans and quell the ocean's periodic bursts of fury that made fishing and travel impossible. This may be why the Skagerrak people once favoured elk bone for carving fish hooks, not solely as functional tools, but also as ones imbued with power, able to help their human users negotiate with the sea. And from here, it's only a short step to explain why ritual burials of such material are found along many coasts. In the Netherlands, at the Hoge Vaart site, accidentally discovered during motorway construction, there are burials of flint tools alongside the skulls of aurochs within a former coastal wetland that may indicate just such an association during these Neolithic times, slightly more than 6,000 years ago. And then, in various parts of the British Isles, are found even older coastal middens containing a range of similarly suggestive material, perhaps in the words of one scholar, speaking of those along the fringe of Oronsay Island, referencing a textural boundary between land and sea. In eastern England, in the year AD 624, that's almost 1400 years ago, the Bretwalda, or High King, named Raedwald, died. So powerful had he been within the Anglo-Saxon lands of central and southern England that many lesser monarchs came to his funeral bearing lavish gifts. As was common at this time, when important people died, a barrow or earthen mound was erected over Raedwald's body. But it was what was found in 1939 inside this barrow, untouched by grave robbers, that makes this story so extraordinary. Raedwald's mound is at a place called Sutton Hoo, east of Ipswich in England, and a couple of kilometres from the coast in AD 624. It seems the mourners dragged a large ship on shore in which to bury Raedwald, along with those of his possessions that he valued most, and many of the gifts presented at his funeral. When this was over, everything was encased in earth, creating a giant barrow or mound. Regarded as unique at the time it was discovered, the Sutton Hoo ship burial is actually far from this. Ship burials of important peoples have been found in many parts of northwest Europe, involving both Anglo-Saxon leaders like Raedwald and also Vikings. And it may be that ship burials of the kind Raedwald was given were not simply appropriately grand and stately, but were also considered to ensure that the dead person would be able to return promptly to the ocean's embrace, equipped with everything a person of high status would need there. Today we regard the coast differently, because we regard the ocean differently to the ways our ancestors did long ago. The ocean is no longer the mysterious, depthless place of beginning and endings. It's not a place we need to regard as a source of aggression, for with our understanding, our ability to scan the ocean from top to bottom, side to side, and to monitor its every ripple, we have nothing to be apprehensive about. But that is something which has come at a very late stage in human history. So next time you're wandering a deserted stretch of coastline and you come across a scatter of boulders, imagine what they might represent. Perhaps the remains of an attempt to stop the apparently unremitting encroachment of the sea onto the land. Perhaps a reminder that off this particular coast there once stood places, villages, towns and cities that people once inhabited, places now forgotten, or at best stirred into the soup of folklore and mythology. Perhaps a reminder that there is so much more to be learnt about human history, and that much of what we do not know lies beneath the ocean's surface. Yet pinch yourself and know that you are real, for the very fact that you and I have made it this far across 200,000 years of time, punctuated by occasional extreme, almost unimaginably large and disruptive events, shows that humanity is resilient and able as a species to survive just about anything nature cares to throw at us. In January 2019, I was staying a few nights in a small village on the remote island of Kêr-Is in the south of the Fiji archipelago. I was there with one of my research students, collecting stories about a volcanic eruption that took place on Kêr-Is Island about 2,000 years ago. Well, we eventually collected different versions of this story from 13 different communities in the area. A novel and practical demonstration of the longevity of such stories in essentially non-literate contexts. I remember asking one of our informants, he was an elderly man, about whether he was passing on these ancient stories to his children and grandchildren. And clearly I touched a nerve, for he lit up and he grabbed my knee to stress his point and said, No, they're not interested. They have these devices instead. And he did this with his hand. Now this incident seems to me to capture the tragedy of what humanity has been losing for hundreds of years, and may be on the cusp of losing altogether. Oral traditions, memories of ancient times, ancient understandings of lands long gone. My new book, Worlds in Shadow, is an attempt to reverse, perhaps just slow this process, by highlighting some of the ways our ancestors recalled the past. I show how the past was actually quite different to the way we might imagine it was. Before humans became literate, before they could read and write, they were nevertheless ingenious chroniclers of human history, even able to recall things that happened millennia earlier. That said, I'm not trying to romanticize the past. We're much better off on balance being literate, being able to read and write and, reference things we cannot remember whenever we need to do so. But it has made us lazy, not just because we no longer have a need to remember everything ourselves. I mean, how many telephone numbers can you remember? But also because literacy allows us to indulge the default view that everything worth knowing, now and in the past, is written down, which is simply not true. Literacy has also encouraged us to view the world more simply, more two-dimensional than it really is. Mermaids never existed. Are you stupid? People say they can see people moving around on this land under the sea. They can hear roosters, even mosquitoes buzzing there. Well, these people must be idiots. In Australia, there is an Aboriginal song which talks about how Indigenous peoples feel the pulse of the land. Now, once everyone could feel that, just as they could hold the equivalent of 100 telephone numbers in their heads. Some such times were far back in human history, when our ancestors lived in places that are now under often tens of meters of ocean water, places that can no longer be located, places that for this reason have moved from the real world into the shadowy worlds of memory and eventually myth. Today we inhabit a drowning world, and this rightly makes us concerned. Over the next 100 years or so, the inexorable rise of the ocean surface will cause humanity significant problems. And while these will force adjustment to the ways that we live, what climate scientists term adaptation, neither the challenges nor their solutions are unprecedented. We have been here before, and the very fact that we have made it through suggests that we shall do so again. Learning about the past and the bumps in the road our species were forced to negotiate en route to the present can help us put things into perspective. I want to talk briefly about why I wrote this book. Anxiety levels were high in the post-World War II decades into which I was born, and anxiety was increased by the threat of nuclear catastrophe. Many young people like myself sought reassurance from what others had inferred about the distant past, particularly about the supposedly wondrous worlds our ancestors inhabited that now lie deep beneath the ocean surface. Stories of places like the fabulous and invented island continent of Atlantis, where advanced civilizations had allegedly once existed but had become extinguished. All of these were hugely attractive subjects for popular belief. And while the Atlantis story is unquestionably fiction, Plato used real catastrophic events from the Eastern Mediterranean to enhance the plausibility and thus the memorability of his narrative. Being trained as a geologist eventually allowed me to understand the nature of such events. All the time I've spent immersed in the cultures of the Pacific Islands region led me to uncover people's stories about submerged lands, some of which are discussed in Worlds in Shadow, including those of sunken Hawaii, the Polynesian homeland, and the wandering islands of Kêr-Is and the Tuamotus, and the abrupt submergence of islands in Solomon Islands and Vanuatu that can be explained by undersea landslides triggered by large earthquakes. Volcano stories abound in the Pacific Islands, and I tell one in Worlds in Shadow that involves a man named Pa'e, who lived on the now obliterated island of Kauai in Vanuatu. Although I explain in the book, I won't mention here what happened to make Pae so angry, but he sought a terrible revenge on his kinsfolk that involved a magic lizard and 6 inflated pig bladders tied to an ironwood tree. When Pae burst the last of these, a volcano opened up at the base of the tree, and Pae cried out, "Your time has come, and my time as well," and most of the island of Kauai disappeared into the ocean. Well, so struck was I by these Pacific Islander stories that I wrote a book, 2009, called Vanished Islands and Hidden Continents of the Pacific, which I think really makes the point that Europe does not have a monopoly on stories about submerged lands, and nor indeed on the wisdom they contain, which today we would not be able to access any other way except from these stories. Like all good research, my interest in the nature of submerged lands and the roles they played in human history has built on the work of others. Now, most of these people are long gone, their writings coming from an age when disciplinary boundaries were far less rigid than they are today. For today, while every scientist espouses, at least publicly, the importance of cross-disciplinary research, there are limits. And I can still remember the reactions of many of my geologist colleagues when I first started talking and writing about the possibility that some islands had once vanished abruptly. And I can remember as well the sneers of others who had spent a lifetime studying the Pacific Islands and yet were horrified that any Western-trained scientist would dream of taking seriously the people's stories. Well, I'm over that. In no small part thanks to a handful of broad-minded scientists and, of course, an unrelentingly supportive family. Worlds in Shadow has been gestating for a few years, so I'm immensely proud that it's now published. I think it succeeds in communicating a broad range of ideas, peppered with examples from all over the world, in a way that's engaging and unpretentious. So my thanks to you all for watching me today. I hope you've found something worthwhile in what I've had to say, and I look forward to engaging further with you all at the 2021 Edinburgh Science Festival.